Nelson Mandela was not born a global icon. He started life as a boy named Rolihlahla in a small village called Kunu. In his language, Xhosa, his name meant troublemaker, which looking back seems like a perfect fit. He grew up listening to the stories of his elders, stories of a time before white settlers came and changed everything. These tales planted a seed in him, a deep love for his people's history and a sense of justice. He was raised to be a counselor to the king, but destiny had a much bigger, more complicated plan for him. His early life was simple, but it was filled with the traditions and values that would guide him through the darkest of times. He learned about leadership not from books, but from watching tribal leaders listen to every single person before making a decision. As a young man, Mandela moved to Johannesburg, and that's where he saw the true face of apartheid. It was a system of laws created by the white government to keep black people down. Imagine living in your own country but being told you are a second-class citizen. You couldn't vote, you couldn't live where you wanted, and you couldn't get a good job simply because of the color of your skin. Mandela, a trained lawyer, saw this injustice up close every single day. He knew this was wrong. He knew he had to do something. It wasn't just about politics for him, it was deeply personal. He joined the African National Congress, or ANC, to fight back, not with guns at first, but with words and protests. The fight started peacefully. Mandela and his comrades organized boycotts and non-violent demonstrations. They believed they could change the minds of the powerful through reason and moral pressure. They were inspired by leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, but the government didn't listen. Instead, they responded with more violence and stricter laws. The police would beat protesters and throw them in jail. The Sharpeville massacre in 1960 was a turning point. Police opened fire on a crowd of peaceful protesters, killing 69 people. It became clear to Mandela and the ANC that simply asking for freedom wasn't going to work. The government was not playing fair, so the rules of the game had to change. This led to a difficult and heavy decision. Mandela co-founded the armed wing of the ANC called Umkhonto we Sizwe, or Spear of the Nation. It was a last resort. He believed that if the government only understood the language of force, then they had to speak it. This was not a decision made lightly. Mandela was a man who wanted peace, but he felt cornered. He was now officially a wanted man, a troublemaker, not just by name but by action. He had to go into hiding, living in the shadows, moving from one safe house to another, all while trying to lead a revolution against a powerful and ruthless state. His journey from a village boy to a freedom fighter was complete. The government eventually caught up with Nelson Mandela. In 1962, he was arrested and put on trial. At the famous Rivonia Trial, he and his fellow activists faced the possibility of the death penalty. Standing in the courtroom, Mandela gave a speech that would echo through history. He told the court that he was prepared to die for his ideals of a democratic and free society. He didn't hide what he did, he owned it. He explained why he had turned to armed struggle. His powerful words showed the world that this wasn't a criminal, but a leader fighting for the basic rights of his people. The court sentenced him to life in prison, thinking they could silence him by locking him away forever. They were wrong. Mandela was sent to Robben Island, a harsh and unforgiving prison surrounded by cold, shark-infested waters. For 18 of his 27 years in captivity, this was his home. The conditions were brutal. Prisoners were forced to do hard labor like breaking rocks in a limestone quarry. The blinding glare from the white stone permanently damaged his eyesight. The food was terrible and the guards were cruel. They tried to break the prisoners' spirits to make them forget who they were and what they were fighting for. The goal was to crush their hope, to make them feel isolated and defeated. Every day was a battle for survival, not just of the body, but of the mind and soul. But even in that dark place, Mandela's spirit refused to be broken. He became a leader inside the prison walls. He organized the other political prisoners, creating what they called Mandela University. They would share knowledge, teach each other everything from literature to politics, and hold secret debates. He even learned Afrikaans, the language of his oppressors, because he believed you must understand your enemy to defeat them. He showed that you could be physically imprisoned, but keep your mind free. He turned a place of punishment into a center of learning and resistance. The prison was meant to be the end of his story, but instead it became its most powerful chapter. The years passed slowly. Mandela was allowed few visitors, and his letters were heavily censored. He was cut off from his family and the outside world. He missed watching his children grow up. The personal cost was immense, a sacrifice most of us can barely imagine. Yet through it all, he held on to his dignity. He refused to be treated as less than human. The government offered to release him several times, but only if he renounced the struggle. He refused every time. He would not trade his principles for his personal freedom. He knew that his freedom was tied to the freedom of all his people. He would walk out as a free man in a free country, or not at all. While Nelson Mandela was locked away on Robben Island, something incredible started to happen outside the prison walls. His name, which the South African government tried so hard to erase, became a rallying cry for justice around the world. The ANC, operating in exile, made sure his story was told. They launched the Free Nelson Mandela campaign, and it caught fire. People who had never even heard of South Africa started learning about apartheid. They were shocked that such a racist system could exist in the 20th century. Mandela was no longer just a man. He became a symbol of the global fight against oppression everywhere. Artists and musicians played a huge role in making him a household name. In 1984, the song Free Nelson Mandela by the Special AKA became a massive hit in the United Kingdom. It was an upbeat, catchy protest song that got people dancing and thinking at the same time. Then in 1988, a massive concert was held at Wembley Stadium in London to celebrate his 70th birthday and demand his release. Superstars like Stevie Wonder, Whitney Houston and Sting performed for a global television audience of 600 million people. Suddenly, everyone knew who Nelson Mandela was. He was the most famous prisoner in the world, and the pressure on the South African government was becoming immense. This international pressure worked. Countries began imposing economic sanctions on South Africa. Big companies pulled their businesses out of the country. South Africa was becoming isolated, a pariah state on the world stage. The government could no longer ignore the calls for change. Inside South Africa, the resistance was also growing stronger. Young people who were born long after Mandela was imprisoned were chanting his name in the streets, risking their lives to continue the fight he had started. The government was facing pressure from the outside and from within. The walls of apartheid were beginning to crack. Finally, after 27 long years, the moment the world had been waiting for arrived. On February 11, 1990, the South African government, led by a new president, F.W. de Klerk, released Nelson Mandela from prison. The world held its breath as he walked out hand in hand with his wife Winnie, holding his fist up in a sign of victory. He was older, his hair was grey, but his spirit was as strong as ever. He wasn't bitter or broken. He was ready to lead. His release wasn't the end of the struggle, but it was the beginning of the end for apartheid. The prisoner had become the hope of a nation. After walking out of prison, Nelson Mandela faced his biggest challenge yet to dismantle apartheid and build a new, democratic South Africa without starting a civil war. The country was on a knife's edge. Years of hatred and violence had left deep wounds. Many people, both black and white, were scared of what would come next. They expected a wave of revenge, but Mandela chose a different path. He chose peace and reconciliation. He began negotiations with the same government that had locked him away for decades. It was a remarkable display of leadership. He knew that talking was the only way to avoid a bloodbath and build a future for everyone. These negotiations were difficult and tense. There were moments when it seemed like everything would fall apart. But Mandela's patience and strategic wisdom held everything together. He worked with President F.W. de Klerk, and together they navigated the country towards its first ever democratic election where all citizens, regardless of race, could vote. For this incredible achievement, they were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993. It was a testament to their courage to choose partnership over conflict. Mandela showed the world that even the deepest divides could be bridged when leaders are committed to peace. In 1994, South Africa held its first free election. Long lines of people, many of whom were voting for the very first time in their lives, snaked through towns and villages. It was a day of immense joy and celebration. Nelson Mandela was overwhelmingly elected as the first black president of South Africa. In his inauguration speech, he spoke of a rainbow nation, a country where all people, black and white, could live together in harmony. He didn't talk about punishing the old rulers. Instead, he invited his former jailers to his inauguration, a powerful symbol of forgiveness that stunned the world. He was now President Mandela, or Madiba, as his people affectionately called him. As president, Mandela's greatest legacy was his focus on healing. He established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a court-like body where victims of apartheid could tell their stories and perpetrators could confess their crimes in exchange for amnesty. It wasn't about revenge, it was about acknowledging the truth of the past so the country could move forward. He famously wore the jersey of the Springboks, the national rugby team once beloved only by white South Africans, to the 1995 Rugby World Cup final. This simple gesture united the nation in a way no political speech ever could. Mandela's life teaches us that true leadership is not about power, but about service, forgiveness, and the incredible strength of the human spirit to overcome hate.